Hello everyone, welcome to The Science Buffer. I'm your host Allison Lamoureux, a young science communicator excited to share my love for science with others. I'm very excited to be developing this podcast, and I wanted to start off by introducing myself. A little bit of background on who I am and my education. I'm a graduate of Seton Hall University, where I received my Bachelor of Arts in Biology and was a member and graduate of the first class of the Buccino Leadership Institute. I'm also a first-year student in Stony Brook University's Master of Science and Science Communication program. My interests lie in making science news and stories more accessible to general audiences, combating science misinformation, and learning about and sharing how to communicate science failures. Ever since I was young, science has always been my favorite topic. Sure, don't get me wrong, I loved school and all of the subjects I learned about, but science was always my absolute favorite. I don't think I ever could see myself doing something that wasn't related to science in some way. Whether it was being excited about eclipses to taking high school classes focused on the health sciences and even a little bit of forensics, science has always been a big part of my academic interests. I wanted to start a podcast that's dedicated to all the curious minds out there who either already have a passion for science or have always wanted to get into science but were maybe too intimidated by it or never really knew where to start. Now, you might be asking yourself, what's up with the name? How did you come up with the Science Buffer? For me, naming this podcast was probably the hardest part of pre-production. I knew I wanted to keep it science related, but I also wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be too specific to one science field or another. So I came up with the Science Buffer. If you've taken a chemistry class before or know a little bit about chemistry, you might remember that buffers help maintain a balance in pH levels. The name The Science Buffer stems from my goal of making science more accessible by making this podcast a buffer or balance or bridge between scientists and non-scientists, though I do hope that this does not act as a barrier, and I hope that you, the listeners, will still be interested in learning more on your own. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how this podcast will go. Episodes will go live Sunday evenings and should be expected to be between 30 to 90 minutes long, depending on the content and the story we're covering that week. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what you guys should expect as listeners for what kind of content you'll hear about. I think it's really important to not just share the science news, whether it's new NASA missions or exciting new research developments, but also science stories. Who are the people behind the news that we see in the headlines? What are these institutes that we so often hear about? And where did our interest in the science even come from? Each episode will start with a brief news recap where I'll cover a few different news stories that have typically been released within that 2-week period. Then, the majority of the episode will be covering a science story, whether it's an extension or deep dive into one of those news stories in the recap, or maybe something completely different. In the future, I also hope to be able to conduct interviews with scientists and science communicators as well to hear their stories, and these interviews will take place instead of the science story. If you do have any suggestions on science stories or science news to cover, or if you'd like to ask a question, I'm going to have a Google form going live in the next couple of weeks where you can provide me with episode topic ideas, or if you find some fascinating science news, you can submit that as well for me to take a look at. Thank you so much for joining me here at the Science Buffer. I'm very excited to share this podcast with you, and I hope you, the listeners, enjoy it as well. If you're interested in tuning in to future episodes, please feel free to subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. In the next few weeks as well, I will have some social media accounts created for the podcast, so you can follow along for new episode releases, along with sharing that form to get listener feedback and episode suggestions. Thank you so much, and I look forward to sharing this podcast with you.